Great. Welcome, everybody. Um, I'm sure people will continue to join, but we shouldn't penalize everybody who got here on time. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Brad Ack. I'm the CEO of Ocean Visions, and we are really delighted today to have Romany Webb with us to talk about her work on a lot of the legal issues related to ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, and particularly about the permitting and regulatory framework. But Romany has a lot more experience than just that topic. She might be one of the leading scholars on this topic generally around the legal frameworks for carbon removal, and she's been specializing for some time. She's currently the deputy director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and an associate research scholar at Columbia University Law School. She focuses on two key areas: energy and negative emissions. And obviously, we're going to be talking today mostly about the negative emissions part of her work. She was on the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's panel on ocean-based CDR. Many of you, I'm sure, probably all of you have seen that report. And she stays pretty active in this space. We were really fortunate to have Columbia agree to work with us on developing this draft. Well, they did all the work to agree to develop this draft model federal law to facilitate the accelerated research and development that we believe we need for ocean-based carbon removal as part of our overall carbon removal challenge. And that is what we will focus on primarily today, and give everybody a chance to hear what's in that draft document, or that final document, but which is a draft proposal, and then an opportunity to ask questions about it and make comments as well. And this is being recorded for people who can't attend right now. So just know that you're being recorded. And with that, I will turn it over to Romany. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you all today. I am going to talk about the Model Laws project that we've been working on that was very generously supported by Ocean Visions. And I look forward to what will hopefully be a robust discussion and getting some feedback from all of you on some of the concepts that are in that model law, because we really do see it as the start of a conversation around what the legal framework for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal research should look like. Before I talk about the model law, though, I do want to talk more generally about how ocean-based carbon removal is currently regulated in the US and to an extent internationally, and why we might need a new legal framework. So I'm going to share my screen here. This setup. All right. So obviously, this audience, I'm sure, is aware there's a lot of buzz around ocean CDR at the moment. We know that we need to accelerate efforts to address climate change. Progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been fairly slow. And as a result, it's becoming increasingly clear that simply reducing emissions will not be sufficient. And we will also need to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. In its latest assessment report, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that deployment of carbon dioxide removal in particular is unavoidable. So if we take that as a given, then the question becomes, what form of CDR should we be pursuing, or can we pursue? And it is very likely that we'll need to deploy a sort of portfolio of CDR approaches, both terrestrial or land-based and ocean-based. A variety of ocean-based approaches to CDR have, of course, been proposed. This graphic is taken from that 2022 National Academies study that Brad mentioned, and that many of you will have seen. The sort of key takeaway from that report was that while these approaches appear to hold promise, and some of them appear to hold really significant promise, there are some important unresolved questions about how well they work, how effective they are in removing and durably storing carbon dioxide, what other co-benefits they might have, and also any potential risks. And so there is a real need for more research, including in particular in ocean research in ocean field tests to answer those questions so that society can make decisions about larger scale deployments and can do so quickly so that we can achieve our climate goals. Oops. So we're already seeing significant funding for research coming from governments around the world, including here in the US. Again, many of you will be aware of the Department of Energy's Mariner program, which has for several years now been supporting research into seaweed cultivation. Earlier this year, the Department of Energy announced a new program aimed at advancing a broader range of ocean CDR techniques through work on MRV, monitoring, verification, and reporting. NOAA, of course, also has NOAA and partners also have a funding proposal out at the moment. And there are just a huge number of bills floating around Congress that would allocate even more money to those and other agencies to support ocean CDR research. At the same time, we're also seeing a lot of private sector investment, of course, in ocean CDR, a lot of new startups that have been established with the goal of commercializing some of these technologies. And so we're sort of really in the early stages of the development of a new industry around ocean CDR. Now, in the circles I move in sort of legal and policy circles, we hear a lot about the policies and incentives that are needed to support the development and growth of that new industry. We hear a lot less about the legal framework within which that industry operates. And that's a real problem because legal considerations will have a major bearing on whether, when, where, and how first ocean CDR research and any subsequent deployment can happen. So at the Sabin Center, we have been working for several years now on looking at the legal issues around ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. We started out by looking at how ocean CDR fits within existing legal frameworks, both at the international level and domestically in 7 countries. And we collected that work in a book that was just published a couple of weeks ago. It discusses, as I said, the application of international law and also the domestic laws across 7 different countries to various ocean CDR techniques. I am, of course, compelled to say that this is a great read. It is chock full of really great information, and you should all check it out. But I will also let you in on a little secret, which is that a good chunk, not all of it, but some of the information that's in this book is also in a series of white papers that we at the Sabin Center published and that are freely available on our website. So we published white papers that look at the treatment of different ocean CDR techniques under international law and domestic US law. And so you can see here, got papers on seaweed cultivation, ocean fertilization, ocean artificial upwelling and downwelling, and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And looking across those papers at the sort of analysis that we did of US domestic law, the sort of key finding was that currently in the US, there's no comprehensive legal framework specific to ocean CDR, but there are a large body of general environmental laws that could apply to or have implications for ocean CDR projects. Those general laws were developed with other activities in mind. And so there's often a lot of uncertainty and complexity around how they will apply to ocean CDR. Part of the complexity here, of course, stems from the fact that we're talking about activities taking place in the ocean, which is a shared resource. Under international law, generally speaking, countries that border the ocean have some primary jurisdiction or authority over areas within 200 nautical miles of their shores. In the US, authority over that 200 nautical mile zone is shared between the federal government and coastal states and territories, and sometimes local governments and Native American tribes within those coastal states and territories. At each level of government, there are multiple agencies involved in managing ocean resources and overseeing ocean-based activities. So, just at the federal level, there's about a dozen different federal agencies that are involved in ocean and planning and management in some way. And those bodies operate pursuant to a variety of different laws that incorporate different requirements and standards. So this table, again, was in the 2022 National Academies of Science report. It shows some of the key federal environmental laws that could apply to different types of ocean CDR activities in different nearshore locations. The sort of details of this don't matter so much as like it gives a sense of just the myriad of laws that can apply here. And the interactions between them are often very complex. The National Academies report makes the point that this is not a complete list and it's just federal statutes. So in some cases, particularly for nearshore projects, in addition to all of these and other federal laws, there'll also be state laws, potentially local laws, tribal rules, and the like. And so the result is this very, very complex legal framework that I would argue is really not fit for purpose. And there's two primary problems with the existing legal framework. One is that because there are all these different bodies involved and they're applying all these different laws, this creates this really complex legal framework, as I said, and it's likely to be very difficult for ocean CDR researchers to navigate and could be a real barrier to research projects, particularly in ocean projects moving forward. Those projects may be subject to multiple overlapping, duplicative, and in some cases even conflicting permit and other requirements that are going to be just incredibly difficult, costly, and time-consuming to comply with. So that's one set of problems. A second set of problems is that in some cases, there are sort of key gaps and shortcomings in these existing laws that mean that they might not always adequately protect the environment, they might not always adequately minimize risks to communities, and they might not prevent rogue actors from moving ahead with either research or larger scale projects that are not scientifically sound or are otherwise undesirable. And if that happens, if we do see these sorts of rogue actors moving forward, that will have really enormous implications for public license or social license and public acceptability of these activities and our ability to really move forward with them in the future. And so given all of this, there is a need, I would argue, to develop new legal frameworks that are specifically designed for ocean carbon dioxide removal. And that is what our Model Laws project that Brad mentioned that was supported by Ocean Visions really aims to do. We launched the project in June last year, and the goal of the project was to draft a piece of legislation that could be enacted by Congress, and if enacted, would create a new domestic legal framework specifically for ocean CDR. The legislation has sort of two primary goals. First, to facilitate needed ocean CDR research, including in ocean field trials, and second, to ensure that those trials and other research occur in a scientifically robust, safe, responsible, and just way. So we published the model legislation in March. It does a few different things. It defines the scope of federal authority over ocean CDR research. It establishes a new regime for permitting individual ocean CDR research projects. It establishes a framework, or it establishes requirements for consultation and assessment of environmental risks, and it incorporates safeguards to ensure that risks are sort of minimized and benefits are maximized. In developing the model legislation, we did a lot of sort of stakeholder outreach and consultation. We held 2 stakeholder workshops that included government representatives, scientists, policy experts, lawyers, and others working in the ocean CDR field. We also held a series of one-on-one interviews to solicit additional feedback. And we had a draft of the model law reviewed by key individuals, primarily, but not only lawyers who are working in this space. So I want to spend a few minutes now highlighting some of the key aspects of the model law. So first, the model law, as I said, creates a legal framework specifically for ocean CDR research. It does not permit or otherwise regulate ocean CDR deployment. You can see on this slide the definition of research that's used in the model law refers to an action or activity undertaken for the primary purpose of advancing scientific understanding of ocean carbon dioxide removal techniques. And we define ocean carbon dioxide removal techniques to include activities, processes, technologies, or systems that take place in the ocean, extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either directly or indirectly, and durably store that extracted carbon dioxide. You see here that the definition of research expressly excludes deployment, and deployment is defined as activities that use ocean CDR techniques to remove 100,000 metric tons or more of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We chose that 100,000 metric ton sort of threshold to align with what's used in the European Union's Carbon Storage Directive. That directive includes a carve-out for so-called research projects that involve storage of less than 100,000 metric tons. We recognize, though, that that threshold may not be appropriate for all activities. And so we've built into the model law a mechanism whereby that threshold can be adjusted either up or down. One other thing to note about the definition of research is that there's no mention in here of sort of commercial activities or economic gain. This has been a big issue at the international level, particularly in international discussions around how to regulate ocean fertilization. We've seen the parties to a set of international agreements called the London Convention and Protocol adopt a series of non-binding resolutions dealing with the regulation of ocean fertilization research. And in there, they say that, research really shouldn't yield any economic gain, that it shouldn't be influenced by any sort of economic or commercial factors. And so when we went through our consultation process in developing the model laws, this is something that we got a lot of feedback on. There were arguments sort of on both sides for incorporating that restriction. We decided not to because of concerns that it could hinder or restrict private sector investment in ocean CDR research. We recognize that private sector investment has been really important for enabling past research and will likely be very important for enabling future research. One other thing to note about sort of the scope of application of the model law is that it only applies to research projects that take place in US ocean waters, which basically means within that 200 nautical mile zone over which the US exercises jurisdiction. The model law would not apply to research projects undertaken on the high seas or in international waters, even if those projects have some link to the US, because, for example, they're conducted by a US citizen or use a US registered vessel. And I'm happy to talk more about sort of why we limited the geographic scope in that way in the Q&A if there's interest in that. So that's sort of how the model law applies. Then the question is, what does it do? So one of the key things that the legislation does is to assert federal jurisdiction or authority over all ocean CDR research in US waters. So remember I said before that within that 200 nautical mile zone, authority is shared between the federal government and the states and sometimes the local governments and the tribes. And that there are and can be these sort of overlapping federal, state, local, tribal requirements for ocean CDR research. The model law removes that sort of duplication and says that the federal government is in charge of overseeing these projects and of permitting these projects. The model legislation designates a single federal agency that is responsible for doing those things. We don't, in the model legislation, specify which agency should be in charge. Stakeholders expressed a lot of different views on that. Some supported NOAA, some supported the Environmental Protection Agency, some supported the Department of Energy, and others. There were good arguments sort of for and against each of those agencies. And ultimately, we think that it's going to be a political decision. So we don't specify in the model law. But we do think that it is absolutely essential to have a single federal agency solely responsible for permitting and otherwise regulating ocean CDR research. Otherwise, you end up in a situation similar to what we have now, where you have these duplicative overlapping requirements imposed by multiple different federal agencies. While we do have this sort of single federal agency in charge, we recognize that that agency, can take advantage of the knowledge of other federal agencies and of states and tribes and local governments. And so we built into the model law sort of requirements for information sharing and consultation between those various bodies. And that's reflected in the very first section of the model legislation, which sets out the purposes and findings of the model legislation, where we emphasize that the federal government has a compelling interest in this topic, but that states and tribes and local governments also have a lot of knowledge and play important roles in ocean management. And so we want to make sure that they have opportunities to provide input into federal decision making. So the way in which that happens is via this sort of mechanism. This is sort of a basic graphical representation of the decision-making frameworks created in the model law. In the middle, you have sort of the key bodies that are sort of created by the model law and have responsibilities under the model law. On the left, in the dark blue, you have the various groups that those bodies are required to engage with when undertaking their activities or making decisions. And then on the right, in the sort of greeny color, you have the sort of outputs of the decision making. So if we start at the top, in the middle is a newly established interagency working group on ocean CDR research. We established that in the model law as a subcommittee within the Ocean Policy Committee, which is, as many of you will know, an already existing body that was established during the Trump administration and is responsible for, among other things, informing and coordinating federal work around ocean research. So the sort of perfect place to house this new interagency working group on ocean CDR research. That interagency working group is to include representatives of all the different federal agencies that have some connection to ocean CDR research. And it would gather expertise from all of these different federal agencies, from new regional bodies that I'll talk about in a moment, and from the public, and it would compile all of that knowledge to produce a national research plan for ocean carbon dioxide removal. That research plan would go to the lead agency, and the lead agency could take it into account in deciding where and how to permit research projects. The National Research Plan would also be used by what we call regional ocean CDR research councils that are established in Section 5 of the model law. These research councils are made up of state and tribal representatives. We, in the model law, designate 4 existing regional ocean partnerships as research councils, and then we create a mechanism for new bodies to become regional research councils. So those councils are, as I said, made up of sort of state and tribal representatives, really intended to be sort of a bridge between the federal decision makers and the more local groups that are affected by those decision makers, by those decisions. What the regional councils do a few different things, but one of the key things they do is to develop what we call regional research programs that basically take the National Research Plan and sort of operationalize it on a regional scale. So they might, for example, look at the recommendations that are made in the National Research Plan and then develop their own plan for coordinating the research that's been proposed with other ocean activities that are taking place in their region and minimizing conflicts between them. Again, those regional research plans go to the lead agency and inform its decisions about sort of where and how to permit projects. Importantly, though, neither the National Research Plan nor the regional research programs are sort of binding on the lead agency. So the lead agency has discretion to allow research projects that, for example, aren't envisaged in those other documents, or aren't supported by those other documents. So drilling in on the lead agency's functions, the sort of key thing, not the only thing, but the key thing the lead agency does is to permit in-ocean research projects. The model legislation establishes 2 tracks for permitting. So one is available for research projects that take place in designated ocean CDR research zones. So these are zones that are identified by the lead agency as being sort of particularly suitable for, or particularly well suited to ocean CDR research. So places where ocean conditions are such that the research will yield useful scientific outcomes, will not have significant adverse impacts on the environment, where conflicts with other users will be, ocean users will be minimized, and the like. The model legislation sets out the process for designating zones, which includes consultation with the regional research councils, and in some cases, consultations with states and tribes and the public. Once a zone has been designated, the lead agency can issue permits for individual projects within that zone, and the permitting process is streamlined. So the thinking there is that the lead agency, when it designated the zones, will have done, a comprehensive environmental assessment. It will have consulted with these various stakeholder groups, and so it doesn't need to do that, at least in the same depth, when it's looking at individual and approving individual projects. We recognize that it might not be possible to conduct all research within these designated zones, and there may be reasons for doing research outside designated zones. So we create a second permitting track for those research projects. In this case, the permitting process includes sort of more extensive environmental review and consultation requirements. We have, though, throughout the model legislation, really tried to balance sort of the need for speed against the need for robust processes, and in particular, community engagement. We think that building in these sort of community engagement and consultation requirements into the permitting processes is really important to build public trust, to build social license for these activities. And that is really essential for sort of moving forward with research and ultimately deployment. We recognize, though, that all of this consultation and engagement takes time, and we don't have a lot of time if we're to sort of fully evaluate these techniques and make timely decisions about deployments. So we've tried to balance the two. There are people who think we have not built in enough consultation requirements, and there's people who think we've built in too many. We've tried to be sort of somewhere in the middle. The model law also includes a range of other provisions around things like permit fees, bonding, and other financial assurance. It includes provisions around when permits can be suspended and cancelled, things like that. So there's a variety of other sort of supporting provisions around what I've presented. But I think in the interest of time, I might leave it there. And we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Romany. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. That would be the best way to do it. There have been a few as we've gone along. I've been sort of tracking them. So let me, I will pass along some of those to you. But first, before we do that, I just want to ask you, is there an analog that you know of for a framework to be laid on top of a plethora of existing regulations and regulatory authorities and sort of sit atop that and in some ways operate independently of that? Or would we be really here proposing something that has no real analog?
There is no perfect analog for everything that's in the model law. When we created the model law, we sort of picked and chose key things that we've seen work in other sectors and in other legal frameworks and put them together. But there are, certainly examples of, for example, this idea in the model law around designating these preferred zones for research and then having streamlined permitting within that. There are sort of analogs for that from, for example, how renewable energy development has proceeded on federally owned land. There are examples of projects being having sort of different environmental review requirements and being sort of carved out of NEPA. We don't fully carve our projects out of NEPA, but we do some things like that are for which there are previous examples.
A couple of detailed questions here. The 100,000 ton description, cutoff point between deployment versus research, is that over what period of time is that?
I believe it's per year, but I would need to double check that.
And then
I was just going to say, it's really intended to capture sort of very large scale projects. Nothing that would be anticipated as part of what we would think of as a research project.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think if you look at like the largest direct air capture plant in the world right now, if I recall, maybe it's changed, is around 4,000 tons a year. So we're talking about a very sizable, a very reasonable size for this kind of research. There's a couple questions about would the money have to flow to the lead agency, or would the lead agency just simply create the plan and then others could apply for federal funding to whoever is the distributor of that money?
In terms of money for sort of the research projects, the money for the research projects would certainly not need to flow to the lead agency. We have built into the model law appropriations for the various bodies to do the work they're assigned in the model law. We think that's really important because we've seen in other contexts that Congress likes to assign new responsibilities to agencies, but sometimes doesn't give them the funding they need to staff up to perform those responsibilities. I mean, what we've seen in the context of EPA's approval of Class 6 carbon storage wells is sort of the perfect example of that. So we have in the model law built-in appropriations to make sure that the agencies have the resources they need to prepare the various plans, to do the permitting. But in terms of the actual funding for research, that could go to NOAA or any other agency that has sort of an appropriate sort of responsibility in this space.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense. And I'll just point out to people who are on the webinar that we did a working group under Ocean Visions did a design for trials around sinking seaweed. So one single pathway within many domains of ocean-based CDR. And the design was to try to answer the most fundamental questions with enough replication so that we would have some certainty for policy and decision making, and that had a price tag of around $500 million. So that's just one pathway out of many that need to be researched. So obviously the money would need to flow from many different sources to many different actors. There's a comment here. Sorry,
I was just going to say on that point, absolutely, I fully agree with you, Brad, but it is not enough to just solely throw money at the problem. If we don't implement these legal reforms to make sure that these funded research projects can actually get the permits they need to go out into the ocean and do stuff, the money doesn't really mean anything and doesn't really help anything. So that the funding that we need, which is just ginormous and sort of boggles the mind, like that has to come along with the legal reform and the other pieces that are needed to actually move the research forward.
Right. So there's a couple questions about how we're going to get the federal government to consider this. I know that's not exactly your job, but I'm going to ask you to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it is not our job. At the Sabin Center, we are an academic institute. We are not lobbyists. That's not part of what we do. But our part of our mission is to inform legislators and other folks in government about ways to solve legal problems within the climate realm. And we think the model law is a great start for that. It really does help to highlight the challenges that ocean CDR research currently faces, and a potential solution for addressing them. As I said at the top, we see this as the start of a conversation, and really to get more people talking and thinking about how to advance the legal framework here. So, we've been talking to agency folks about this. We included them in our stakeholder workshops. We've been talking to folks on the Hill about this, but as I say, we're sort of not lobbyists, and so we can't move it forward, but we certainly want to get the ideas out there. We want to get people talking about the ideas, and we really want their feedback on the ideas. It may be that the structure we've created, there's key flaws in it. We want to sort of know them and adjust appropriately.
So just to build on that also, we're not lobbyists either at Ocean Visions, but we would love it for anybody who is on this call that has ideas about how we can inform and educate interested policymakers and potentially ask Romany and her team to help with that. Please let us know. Capitol Hill Oceans Week is coming up in a few weeks. We were hoping to maybe put this somewhere on that agenda, but we did not. We weren't able, so far have not been able to do that. But if there's anybody on the webinar that has ideas about just places where these concepts could be introduced and discussed, we would love to hear about that. There's a question about the main MRV challenges, in your opinion, to scaling ocean CDR projects. I don't really know if the model law touched on that very much, but you want to take a crack at that?
No, we don't touch on MRV issues all that much. I will say that, I think that some of the debates and discussions we hear about MRV are really sort of focused exclusively on what's needed for carbon accounting, which will be, of course, very important if we want to use these projects to generate carbon credits and to sell them and fund the projects in that way. But in terms of like permitting projects and thinking about the information that a regulator needs to have confidence that they can approve this project and that it will not decimate ocean ecosystems, the environmental monitoring is going to be really key. And I think sort of so I think it's important that the environmental monitoring is a piece of that. I think that will be absolutely essential for sort of jumping through the various legal hoops that these projects face, and also for building, again, that social license and that public acceptance around these projects, which, as I've said a few times now, but can probably not be said too much, is really, really essential if we're going to do any of this at any sort of scale.
Great. So Libby brings up the Ocean Climate Action Plan, which came out, I believe, after this was published, or at least the comment period was finished before this was published. And so we didn't have a chance necessarily to actually include it, but taking a look at what's recommended there on marine CDR, presuming that you have, what's your reaction to how the Ocean Climate Action Plan approaches facilitating CDR research, these testbed concepts and others?
Yeah, I mean, the testbed concept is not all that different to our designated research zones in our model law. There are some sort of nuanced differences between the two, but it's certainly similar. I think there's some great ideas within the Ocean Climate Action Plan. I am encouraged to see Ocean CDR get a relatively prominent place in that, and I'm encouraged to see the recommendations. Obviously, the administration was working within a particular legal framework and thinking about what it could do within that particular legal framework. And there are some options, but they're constrained. And so our model legislation would remove those constraints and sort of create more flexibility to do things that aren't possible under existing law. So I think it's a great start, and I understand why it's been sort of limited in the way it is, but I don't think it's enough to sort of remove all of the potential legal roadblocks here. And I think that new legislation would be a much better solution.
There are a couple of comments here that aren't questions per se. There's one from Santa McCrory about EPA's role with the MPRSA, and there's also one from Monica Medina about who might be involved in these regional research councils and a recommendation. But those are, I think, just comments for the group. Please correct me if I'm wrong, the people who put those there. There now is a more specific question about micronutrients and whether there's a difference between fishery restoration activity and iron fertilization. And, for the purposes, I guess, of this model law, would fishery restoration fall under this framework, if I understand the question correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend. It would turn sort of whether those sorts of activities are captured would really turn on the definition of research project and the definition of ocean carbon removal in the legislation. The question about whether it's research would really be depend on the specifics of the project and the scale and the aims and so forth of the project. But in theory, it could be captured. I think that if we saw a piece of model legislation, if we saw a piece of legislation like this taken up by Congress, we would likely see sort of more haggling over those definitions in particular, and around sort of what should be captured and what shouldn't. So I think that in the framework we've created, certainly there's the potential for them to be captured, but if this is to move forward, then there will need to be broader discussions around sort of those sorts of questions. As I said, we did stakeholder outreach, but we certainly didn't speak to everybody working in this community, and there would be a need for more of that going forward.
Thank you. I would point out that because I think it's related to the next question too, about already existing activities that cross between, let's say, fisheries management and carbon removal. There's a lot of talk about restoring fish populations to sequester carbon, or whales. So the next one is sort of the same. If an MCDR related activity is already permitted, like a seaweed farm or alkaline wastewater or alkaline effluent coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, would that be subject to any additional regulation under this model law?
So the way the model law is set up is that it would, this model law would, in legal jargon, preempt every other law that could potentially apply to ocean CDR, basically. That means that it would sort of override all of these other general laws that currently apply. There is a carve out in there for existing projects that are already permitted. So it's not like you would have a permitted project and then suddenly your project would not be permitted anymore, because it would need to go through the new permitting process established in the new bill. But if, for example, your permit had a 5-year limit, when you went to renew, you would go through the new permitting process. That's a relatively common approach in sort of the legal world as to how to deal with these sorts of situations where you have already permitted projects, but you're looking to move to a new permitting regime.
Maybe let me try my own answer to that and tell me if it's right. I mean, if somebody already had a permitted activity, not for research, but actually doing something that did lead to carbon removal, and they were legally authorized to do it, and they were selling carbon credits, this model law wouldn't touch that, because that's not research. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So I think that answers Greg's question. So then there's one about whether any regional ocean partnerships have started work on coordinating MCDR. I guess we're talking about existing regional councils. And I don't know if you're able to answer that. Maybe in your research you found out whether anybody was even talking about permitting or coordinating MCDR out there at the regional level or even state level.
At the regional level, in particular around the regional ocean partnerships, we were not able to find anything to suggest that the regional ocean partnerships are already working on MCDR. A lot of those regional ocean partnerships were somewhat hollowed out during the Trump administration. There was a lack of funding and some other challenges. And so some of them have become somewhat dormant, though they are starting to sort of re-pick up, and this could be an issue that they take up in the future. There is certainly a lot of state interest in CDR broadly, and I think in ocean CDR in particular. There are, I would say, at the state level, in terms of what we see from state legislatures and state, governors' offices, a particularly large amount of interest in seaweed cultivation as sort of the first technique that's receiving attention. And we've seen talk about that on the West Coast in particular, but also in some other places. And I think some state legislatures are starting to look at a broader portfolio of CDR approaches and how they might support them.
There's a question about whether DOE has authority now to accelerate permitting for MCDR or ocean-based CDR research.
So DOE, has traditionally, as many people will know, been sort of the lead federal government funder of CDR research broadly and ocean CDR research in particular. We have seen in some of the previous programs some challenges around some challenges in the DOE funding programs because created by permitting. Where DOE had allocated money to a project, but permitting was an issue. Because we're trying to fit ocean CDR projects into these existing laws that are administered by a variety of different agencies, there are really limited options for DOE to sort of accelerate permitting. Certainly it can do informal things like trying to coordinate between agencies and give them advance notice of projects and try to do things like that. But to really address some of the issues around duplication, around overlapping requirements, around just really long timeframes for making decisions and things like that, then we need legislative action.
And just to answer Megan's question there, we did mention that it hasn't been formally proposed to the Biden administration or Congress. There have been informal briefings. Romany has briefed a number of people and we've talked to others, but no formal proposal. So while we wait to see if there's any other questions, I want to ask you one that you showed, the diagram you showed of the structure with the interagency body and all the local bodies and the lead agency. It still seems somewhat complex and questions about, do you have to have the national research plan before the lead agency can advance projects, or are they able to just move forward? I guess at the bottom line is, where does the impetus for this come from? Do we need any sort of a corresponding statement of federal interest in this topic? A statement that, as you pointed out in the beginning, CDR is an imperative. It's going to come from somewhere. It's important for the nation to find out what are the best approaches, and this is part of that process. Do we need something like that to move this, or does it just, you create it and it moves by itself?
Yeah, so there's a few different answers to that. I agree that it is still a relatively complex structure. There is a number of different bodies involved here. But as I said, the decision-making authority rests with that single lead agency. And that's what really sort of simplifies everything. All of those other bodies are really providing input to that lead agency. We think it's important that the lead agency has that input so that, it may not be across what's happening in a particular region, local conditions in a particular state. So we think that sort of information sharing is important to inform the lead agency decision-making, but the fact that the decisions are made by that single agency will, in our view, significantly streamline and simplify the process. In terms of making sure things are moving forward, the model law includes deadlines for various agency actions. So deadlines for the issuance of the national research plan, the regional plans for various decision-making by the lead agency. The lead agency can move ahead before the national research plan is approved and the regional plans are approved. So the work can happen even if those plans and programs are delayed. Which we think is important because there's a need to sort of get projects happening in the short term, but in a responsible way. I think that's important. Of course, we have seen in past examples that statutory deadlines sometimes don't mean all that much to agencies, particularly if they don't have the resourcing they need to meet those deadlines, which is, again, why the funding for the agencies to do the things we're asking them to do is so important. And then the last thing I'll say is that, in the Section 1 of the model legislation sets out the findings and purposes, and it really emphasizes many of those provisions. I didn't show the full section, but many of the sort of subsections within that emphasize the severity of the climate crisis, the devastating impacts that climate change is having on the ocean, the need for action to mitigate and manage those impacts, the potential for ocean CDR to be one of those actions, and the fact that the federal government has, really an essential role to play here and a compelling interest here. And then it also, that section also deals with some of the issues around sort of constitutionality. Of course, we have a federal system of government where the states have important roles and responsibilities. And we're talking about potentially taking authority away from the states and giving it to the federal government. The research we've done indicates that that can be done in accordance with the Constitution because of various sort of complex legal issues that I won't go into, but it's really important to have that all set out in the legislation.
I'm just going to take the opportunity to answer Greg's question. I think we answered this before. If you have an already permitted activity and you're operating within the parameters of the law, then you're not affected by this. And this is for research and for research at significant scales to prove or disprove the function of different technologies. Someone asked about the implication of the London Convention and the protocol and whether it's really a roadblock for certain types of MCDR, like alkalinity enhancement.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of debate about whether the London Convention and London Protocol apply to certain ocean CDR techniques. The London Convention and Protocol are international agreements that regulate what's called ocean dumping, basically the discharge of materials into ocean waters. They were established to deal with things like oil spills and ships depositing trash into the ocean. But they are drafted, they use relatively broad language such that they could, at least in theory, apply to these sort of activities. And there have in the past been discussions under the London Convention and Protocol about regulating ocean fertilization. There's currently an ongoing review that the parties to the London Convention and Protocol are conducting, looking at ocean alkalinity enhancement and seaweed cultivation. So it sort of remains to be seen to some extent, where that review will land and what sort of requirements might be adopted. I will say that, the parties to the London Convention and Protocol have been looking at ocean fertilization specifically since the early 2000s. They have adopted a series of decisions and resolutions on that. The parties to the London Protocol even adopted an amendment on that. None of those things are legally binding. The amendment could become legally binding if it's adopted by enough countries, but so far I think it's only been adopted by 10, maybe even less than 10. So there's a long way to go. Things move very slowly in the international arena, and the model law that we've proposed would not, in any way violate, we think, the US's obligations under the London Convention, which it is a party to.
So one more question. We're coming up near the end of the hour, but if anybody has another one or two to put in, feel free. But this one is about whether this law, if it were adopted as it's currently written, which of course never happened, would of course be changed, but were it to be adopted as it's written, would that preempt the states being more active in ocean-based CDR research? Would they have to conform to a federal plan and not be able to move forward more aggressively?
It would not. So that's an interesting question. I don't think it would prevent the states from supporting, financially or otherwise, research projects that they want to see move forward. Those research projects would have to go through the federal permitting regime. But as I said before, the fact that a state-supported project wasn't, for example, envisaged in the National Research Plan wouldn't prevent it being approved by the lead agency. The model legislation sets out the factors that the lead agency has to consider when it's deciding whether to permit a project. And there are things like, is this project really designed to investigate ocean CDR. What are the environmental impacts? What are the community impacts for, say, nearshore communities, things like that. So, you know, it is, I think, quite possible that adoption of a law like this would actually encourage state level action, because the states would have sort of a sense in advance of the permitting process that projects they support would have to go through. They would be able to evaluate, you know, whether the projects they're supporting meet those statutory requirements for permits. And if they do, then they'd be permitted at the federal level. So I think there could actually be benefits in terms of sort of spurring state level support for research by enacting this law. Having said that, though, you know, there may be some states that are unhappy about, you know, the feds sort of taking over in this realm, and so that could play. But yeah, lots of politics to also consider.
I'm going to ask one last question before we close. There's no more in the chat, and that is, if we were treating this, if we essentially decided that this was an emergency, a term a lot of people use around the climate problem, the climate emergency, and needed to make this happen faster, needed to essentially answer critical questions about ocean CDR pathways in the next 3 to 5 years. Do you think this model law is fit for purpose, or would you change anything if we were on more of an emergency footing?
You know, 3 to 5 years is a short time period for legal decision making, any sort of legal decision making. And I think it would be challenging to move ahead with particularly large scale research projects, certainly within the 3-year mark. Having said that, you know, I think that the structure created within the model law is sound and will accelerate the permitting of research whilst making sure it happens in a safe and responsible way. You know, the key way to sort of cut down some of the time associated with, say, permitting is to reduce the extent. One way to cut down the amount of time that it takes to permit projects is to reduce consultation. But my view is that could ultimately backfire in that, you know, we see large scale research projects happening without adequate community consultation, a lot of community potentially opposition to those projects, and sort of broader implications for subsequent scale up. So, you know, whilst that might save time in the short term, it might actually cost time in the longer term. And so that's why I say, you know, in the model law, we've tried to balance, and there's more work to be done around figuring out that balance between moving forward quickly with research so that we can assess like whether and how we can actually use these things to address climate change, but also making sure that we're educating communities, that we're involving them in decision making, and that we're bringing them along so that, you know, if in the future we do want to scale up these activities, we can do it in a sort of responsible and just way.
You ended right at the top of the hour. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing this with us today. I assume people can follow up with you if they want to, and if anybody has ideas about how we can more broadly socialize this with members of Congress and the administration, please do let us know. But once again, thanks, Romany.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.